Oh, yes.
Hello. I think, Hala, we can start if you
Okay.
wish.
Okay.
Yes, please. I think people are still coming in, but please
Yes,
start.
looking good. Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you so much for joining us today for this meeting. It's a joint meeting between the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, part of the CFS of the FAO, and IPES Food. And we are looking forward to a very interesting and enriching meeting, presentation, a set of presentations, and will be followed by a discussion, reactions, and also questions from the audience. I'd like to let you know that we have interpretation into English, French, and Spanish, so please choose your language. Without further ado, I would like to welcome everyone and welcome our speakers, and would suggest that the speakers would give a short presentation of themselves before they start their talk. Our first speaker today is Molly Anderson from IPES Food, and she will give us a talk about the messages that came out of IPES Food special report. Molly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hala. And let me share my screen. Hang on just a second. Trying to get it in presentation mode. Okay, that looks better. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak today on behalf of IPES Food, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And as Hala said, I'll be summarizing a report that we released in May. The full report is available on the IPES Food website, and it's entitled Another Perfect Storm. We drafted this report because we were seeing recommendations for dealing with spikes in the cost of grain and food insecurity that were headed in the wrong direction and likely to make the situation worse in the short term as well as in the long term. So we are seeing a rapidly unfolding food crisis, food price crisis, with loss of grain, oilseed, fertilizer exports from Russia and Ukraine coming on top of existing supply chain disruptions caused by COVID-19 and already high food price inflation. The FAO Food Price Index declined slightly over the last 3 months, but it's staying close to its record high in March, and volatile grain prices continue. The SOFI 2022 report told us that the right to food for nearly a third of the global population has been compromised, and the number of people affected by hunger, close to starvation, has grown by 150 million since the outbreak of the pandemic, with the number increasing 46 million in 2021 alone. We're not yet facing a global supply shortage, but many countries are facing a food price crisis. The most affected are low-income countries in the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, with high dependency on imported wheat. Ending the war in Ukraine will not solve the global hunger crisis, however. Many of the vulnerabilities in the global food system have been apparent since before the 2007 to 2008 food price crisis, but they simply haven't been fixed. There are 4 structural flaws in the global food system that have turned the shocks from the Ukraine war into a full-blown food price crisis. First, food import dependencies and entrenched production systems, opaque and dysfunctional grain markets, and vicious cycles of conflict, climate change, poverty, and food insecurity. So I'll be dealing with each of these one by one. First, import dependencies. There's been an erosion of traditional diets and increased reliance on staple foods often imported thanks to high-yielding varieties that were introduced in the Green Revolution, the promotion of cash crops under structural adjustment, which necessitates importing staple foods, and public distribution programs. Africa has tripled its food import dependency over recent decades. There have been some food security benefits from these imports, but at the cost of eroding diversity, resilience, and health. The loss of diversity in diets is combined with a lack of diversity in trade flows, creating a highly vulnerable double dependency on food imports from a limited number of countries and only a few companies. This map shows countries that are most dependent on imports, and those imports are coming from 7 countries plus the EU, which account for 90% of the world's wheat exports. Those include Russia and Ukraine, of course. 4 countries account for 87% of the world's maize exports, and 4 companies control 70 to 90% of global grain trade. So let's look at entrenched production systems, the second structural flaw. Food systems are rife with incentives that work against diversity, resilience, agility, and autonomy. These are locked in by policies that serve export industries and a minority of farmers and traders. Research and development, agricultural subsidies, biofuel mandates, and trade agreements reinforce reliance on a small number of crops. Specific authorizations are required for feed, fuel, and food, which make changing crop uses very difficult. In addition, farms and regions have developed commodity-specific skills, equipment, and infrastructures that can't switch easily to other crops. And finally, financial players want commodity crops that are easily tradable, interchangeable, and homogeneous. So let's move to the third structural flaw. If I can move my slide forward. For some reason, there we go. Opaque markets. Total global supplies should be sufficient to meet current needs. So the food price crisis is not all due to supply interruptions. Other contributing factors are the lack of transparency about stocks, especially the amount of grain held in private silos. Speculation also is driving up prices, with more speculative investors versus commercial actors on commodity futures markets since the end of 2020, when the laws were released. Then finally, the poorest countries don't have regional grain reserves, adequate social assistance programs, and other tools to buffer price shocks, which leaves them vulnerable to export bans and reliant on overstretched food aid. The World Food Program says it's facing a 50% rise in costs for global operations. So the fourth structural flaw is vicious cycles of conflict, climate change, poverty, and food insecurity. Millions of people lack the income and resources to adapt to shocks. There are 40 active conflict zones around the world, affecting 2 billion people, half of whom live in extreme poverty. Climate change is happening now. The IPCC reported that climate change has reduced agricultural productivity growth by 21% since 1961, even worse in Latin America and Africa. Poverty and instability are impacts and drivers of the current crisis. So let's go to structural solutions that are needed for these structural problems. First, low-income countries need financial assistance and comprehensive debt relief to afford the higher import bills that they're facing. To build social security systems and to rebuild food production and regional grain reserves. The Common Framework for Debt Treatment in 2020 has not led to debt cancellation for any of the participating countries. And in fact, 62 developing countries spent more repaying debt than they did on healthcare during the pandemic. Second, wealthy countries must ease global price spikes by cracking down on speculation, by ensuring transparency of privately held grain reserves, by reducing the dominance of a small number of grain traders, and by shifting feed and fuel crops to food crops, not intensifying production with more agrochemical inputs. That would be a serious mistake. And finally, all countries must build or rebuild resilient production systems. This crisis is telling us that we must accelerate the transformation to agroecology and diversified production systems with reduced fertilizer and fossil fuel use to increase food self-sufficiency. So thank you. I'll be coming back, and other speakers will be talking more about these problems.
Thank you so much, Molly. This is a very, very important and informative presentation. Myself, coming from Egypt, one of the countries mostly dependent now on import, can feel really more or less all of these points. And I also see the solutions as very, very pertinent and relevant. We had a question in the chat about the sharing of the presentation, but there's also in the chat the link to the report itself. So please go to the chat and click on the link, and you will get the IPES food report, Another Perfect Storm. So now we are going to get a governmental perspective on the crisis. I mean, how does the food crisis affect the countries, and what is the policies response to the food crisis? We are honored to have with us Mehdi Mongi, Deputy Permanent Representative of Cameroon to the United Nations in Rome. Mehdi, please, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you, Hala, and happy to see you again. I think I'm getting used to your facilitation. And also thank you, Molly, for setting the stage. I believe that this is a good start for our conversation. I was requested to look at the government perspective. How does the food crisis affect the countries, and what is their policies responses? I hope that you will not be surprised if I come back to some of the elements that were presented by Molly. It's normal as an introduction to my test. Well, record high food prices have triggered a global crisis that will drive millions more into extreme poverty, magnifying hunger and malnutrition, while threatening to erase hard-won gains in development. The supply chain disruption and the continued economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic are reversing years of development gains and pushing food prices to all-time heights. Rising food prices have a greater impact on peoples around the world. According to the 2022 State of Food Insecurity in the World survey, which is produced by FAO, the number of people affected by the hunger rose in 2021 to 828 million, an increase of about 46 million since 2020 and 150 million since 2019, before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, WFP and FAO warned that acute food insecurity could worsen in 20 countries or areas during June to September 2022. Many reports conclude that alongside conflict, frequent and recurrent climate shocks, economic and health crises, inequalities, and so on, continue to drive acute hunger, consequences of which push millions to the brink in countries across the world. Countries and regions are hit diversely through the following elements. First, the Global Food Price Index. The figures of the World Bank that we have show that of July 15, 2022, the agricultural price index is 19% higher compared to January 2021. Maize and wheat prices are 15% and 24% higher, respectively, compared to January 2021, while rice prices are about 11% lower. The FAO Food Price Index has reached 158.5 points, surpassing the previous peaks of 132.5 and 137.6 recorded during the 2007 and 2008 and 2011 food crisis, respectively. Second, domestic food pricing inflation. Inflation remains high in countries around the world. Information from between February and June 2022 shows high inflation in almost all low and middle income countries. 94.1% of low income countries, 88.9% of lower middle income countries, and 87% of upper middle income countries have seen inflation level above 5%. Global patterns. The World Bank report says that global patterns of trade, production, and consumption of commodities have been altered in ways that will keep prices at historically high levels through the end of 2024. Global commodity market. The global commodity market faces upside risk through the following channels: reduction in grain supplies, higher energy prices, higher fertilizer prices, and trade disruptions. Some global value chains arrangements are seriously threatened. Public debt burdens. Many countries are facing massive public debt burdens that drastically reduce their capability of contracting new debt, thus putting them in the brink of debt default. Income drops. Countries are experiencing dramatic income losses among the poorest communities and are straining the capacities of national government to fund social safety nets, income supporting measures, and the import of essential goods. Threat to political and social stability. Countries around the world are fearing the resurgence of social and political unrest, particularly due to the drastic loss of economic gains and households' livelihood. Faced with these challenges, countries have put in place specific operations to mitigate the effect of the present and looming food crisis. I must say that these are country-specific and may include targeted human action. This is done through anticipatory action, short-term protective intervention to be implemented before new humanitarian needs materialize, and emergency response action to address existing humanitarian needs. Austerity policies. In response to the tightening of the monetary policies in advanced economy to address the rapid increase of inflation risk and the issues of access to credit and debt refinancing for developing economies. Tapping on financial packages. Financial facilities are offered by financial development institutions such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, just to name a few, to boost food and nutrition security, reduce risk, and strengthen food systems. Addressing structural policies. Countries tend to subsidize provision of fertilizer to farmers, fuel prices, to review taxation of imported goods, especially for cereals. They implement new market and trade policy measures to reduce prices for consumers and apply price control measures. Releasing food stock to the market. Many countries released public stock and offer targeted and untargeted subsidies for staple foods. social safety net. These measures may include cash and food transfer and are intended to dampen the social impact of the crisis and to avert starvation and malnutrition of most vulnerable groups in both urban and rural areas. Production support measures. These are measures for medium to long-term results to complement short-term measures of social safety net. I must say that the experience of my country is very, very an interesting one, because we apply some of these measures that I have just outlined. And some worked well, some did not work well. And with the experience of the 2007, 2008, and 2011 crisis, I believe that there has been some readjustment, but not so much because of the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, which surprised almost everybody. I thank you for now and looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I would now like to ask Victor Suarez Carrera, the Vice Minister of Self-Sufficiency, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Mexico, to present the governmental perspective on the food crisis. Victor, please, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. En nombre del Gobierno de México, agradezco al mecanismo de la sociedad civil, del Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria de la FAO y al panel de expertos sobre sistemas alimentarios sustentables la invitación a participar en este evento. Felicito el reporte de la compañera Molly Anderson, coincidimos plenamente con él. En la búsqueda de soluciones estructurales y de emergencia a la crisis alimentaria mundial, es preciso considerar en primer lugar el siguiente mensaje de nuestro presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador en su reciente reunión con el presidente de los Estados Unidos, Joe Biden. Frente a la crisis, la salida no está en el conservadurismo, está en la transformación, actuar con arrojo, transformar, no mantener el statu quo. Sin transformación, continúo mi intervención, la comunidad internacional verá cómo las crisis alimentarias se sucederán unas tras otras, incrementándose la inseguridad alimentaria, propiciando el descontento social y la ingobernabilidad en más países, tal y como ha sucedido con las 3 crisis de alimentos en los últimos 15 años. Entre tanto, el poder y las ganancias de las corporaciones globales, financieras, de energía y de alimentos aumentan año con año. Es el momento de actuar con un enfoque de transformación estructural de los sistemas alimentarios y de su gobernanza a nivel mundial y de cada nación. ¿Qué hemos hecho en México ante el fracaso del modelo neoliberal agroalimentario a nivel global y nacional? México, desde el 1 de diciembre de 2018, con la llegada al gobierno del presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador y su proyecto de la Cuarta Transformación de la Vida Pública de México, dejó atrás las políticas neoliberales y puso en práctica una nueva política de rescate del campo y autosuficiencia alimentaria, priorizando a los pequeños productores con transición agroecológica, sin transgénicos ni glifosato. La Cuarta Transformación de México se rige por los siguientes principios, entre otros: poner fin al neoliberalismo; 2, por el bien de todos, primero los pobres; 3, separar el poder económico del poder político; acabar con la corrupción y poner la soberanía nacional en primer lugar sobre la base de la soberanía energética y la soberanía alimentaria. A continuación se enumeran algunas acciones en favor del rescate del campo y la soberanía alimentaria. Se canalizan 3.500 millones de dólares anuales en programas de apoyo productivo a favor de 3 millones de pequeños productores del campo. Los programas son Producción para el Bienestar, Sembrando Vida, Fertilizantes para el Bienestar, Bien Pesca y precios de garantía para maíz, frijol, trigo, arroz y leche. Estos programas Incluyen 5.800 técnicos y técnicas agroecológicas en apoyo a la transición agroecológica. Se invierte para incrementar la producción de fertilizantes químicos en empresas del Estado para alcanzar en 2024 la producción de 60% de la demanda nacional y entregarlos gratuitamente a los pequeños productores. En 2018, la capacidad de producción era 0. Se han incrementado los salarios mínimos en 95.6% en términos nominales y 42% en términos reales, y el doble en los estados de la frontera norte entre 2019 y 2022. Se canalizan pensiones a todos los adultos mayores y personas con discapacidad, becas para todos los estudiantes desde educación básica y hasta universidad, y becas de aprendizaje laboral para 1 millón de jóvenes que no estudian ni trabajan, entre otros programas de bienestar. Se emitió un decreto presidencial para la prohibición inmediata de la siembra comercial de maíz transgénico y la eliminación gradual del glifosato hasta enero del 2024. Se emitió una ley y una norma para el etiquetado frontal de advertencia en alimentos ultraprocesados y bebidas con azúcares añadidas como parte de una estrategia de combate a la epidemia de obesidad y sobrepeso. Al mismo tiempo, se subsidia la gasolina y el diésel, evitando el impacto inflacionario energético mundial. En México, la gasolina y el diésel es más barato que en Estados Unidos y en Europa. Al mes de junio, la inflación en México fue de 8% en comparación con el 8.6% en la eurozona y 9.5% de Estados Unidos. De este incremento, el aporte de la inflación en los precios energéticos fue de 0.6% en México frente al 4.2% en la eurozona y 3% en Estados Unidos. Lo anterior, debido a la política de soberanía energética del gobierno del presidente López Obrador y la eliminación del cobro de impuestos a las gasolinas para apoyar el ingreso de las familias y a la economía en su conjunto. Mientras que el aporte inflacionario en alimentos en México fue mucho más alto. Fue 3.9% en México contra 1.4% en Estados Unidos y 1.9% en la eurozona. Esto como consecuencia de la dependencia de alimentos y fertilizantes heredada de los gobiernos neoliberales. Por tal razón, el pasado 5 de mayo, el presidente de México puso en marcha un paquete de acciones contra la carestía y la inflación, y el 12 de mayo pasado, una campaña nacional de producción para el autoconsumo. Todo lo anterior ha permitido que en México no haya desabasto, crezca la producción agropecuaria aún en los años de la pandemia y la inflación alimentaria se encuentra contenida, aunque todavía en niveles altos. Con base en lo antes expuesto y frente a la actual confluencia de múltiples crisis alimentarias a nivel mundial, proponemos los siguientes 5 puntos. 1. La ONU y el CSA deben priorizar acciones para poner fin a las hostilidades no solo en Ucrania, sino en otros países y regiones del mundo, incluyendo el cese de bloqueos económicos y sanciones unilaterales. 2. Frente a la apuesta al alargamiento del conflicto en Ucrania y al incremento de presupuestos para armas, la ONU debe llamar a negociaciones de paz y a frenar la carrera armamentista y el escalamiento bélico, llamar a incrementar la inversión pública en la producción local de alimentos y en el bienestar de los más pobres, y a constituir un Fondo Mundial de Fraternidad y Bienestar, siguiendo la propuesta de nuestro presidente en el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas el pasado 9 de noviembre. 3. Reconocer que el modelo neoliberal de revolución verde y de dependencia alimentaria es un factor fundamental de la inseguridad alimentaria mundial y de las naciones. En consecuencia, debe instituirse la política de soberanía alimentaria con base en la transición agroecológica, los derechos humanos y el fomento productivo de los pequeños agricultores y pescadores. 4. Es preciso limitar la influencia antidemocrática de las corporaciones agroalimentarias, financieras y energéticas en los organismos de las Naciones Unidas y en la definición de las políticas nacionales. Y por último, 5. Respaldamos enteramente la propuesta del mecanismo de la sociedad civil y reiteramos la propuesta de nuestro gobierno expresada en el CSA 49 sobre la necesidad de que el CSA establezca un grupo de trabajo de composición abierta, convocando a la participación de los países miembros y otras agencias para acordar una hoja de ruta para la transformación de los sistemas agroalimentarios globales. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It echoes a lot of our ideas and our aspirations also for the future, and very relevant and optimistic. And thank you so much for this. I now call upon Patty. Patty Nyler is part of the CSIPM Coordination Committee, and she is also a member of the Via Campesina. She's going to present to us the analysis of the situation and also the demands by the CSIPM. Patty, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We've had 3 excellent presentations already, so I will be just building on the current dialogue. We are here today in response to yet another crisis of rapidly rising food prices, which threatens to push millions more people into hunger. This situation, like similar crises this world has seen before, exposes the inability of the agro-industrial food system to respond adequately, and the culpability of the system in creating crises. It also exposes the unbearable dependencies and vulnerabilities of global food systems in which the market determines the price of our food. This food system was made possible by neoliberal policies and based on corporate-led, intensive, export-oriented production for food supply chains. Prices cannot be stabilized without market and financial regulation, which demand government interventions. Countries that suffer from debt, and dependency on food imports are particularly affected, leaving them with no means to cope during times of crisis. In fact, these crises do not truly end, but instead continue as poverty and inequalities grow deeper. If farmers, peasants, indigenous peoples, and others are unable to access resources such as land, seed, and water, or are unable to maintain a dignified livelihood to produce food for their communities, recovery from these crises is nearly impossible. Yet, proposals by Rome-based agencies, major exporting countries, the G7, and financial institutions employ a public framing of the current crisis as almost exclusively from a market and production perspective, and as caused by the disruption of global trade due to a war involving 2 major agro-exporting countries. Why so many countries in the global south have become dependent on imports, or why we continue to face unconscionable levels of hunger despite many years of record food production on a global scale, are not even questioned. Instead, this dominant narrative focuses on ensuring smooth functioning of international markets and calls for ramping up of agricultural production of commodity crops with little regard to environmental, biodiversity, or climate-related standards. The dominant economic actors use political spaces they control, such as the G7, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, to impose their responses, further increasing inequalities within and across countries, particularly marginalizing populations and countries with fragile national policy spaces and fragmenting multilateral spaces. Their responses are biased, insufficient, and short-sighted for these reasons. 1, they are not based on a human rights approach. There is no meaningful participation of the most marginalized and affected constituencies. 2, they are not proposing any policy or normative changes for a profound food systems transformation to address the multiple and intertwined crises of the present and the future, nor are they setting in place the policies to advance long-term solutions based on food sovereignty and economic, social, gender, and climate justice. 3, they do not address the challenges faced by indigenous peoples and pastoralists whose traditional food systems provide critical food security for millions of indigenous people and beyond, where dominant corporate actors and interests often act in disruptive ways, ignoring the rights of indigenous peoples. 4, they do not address the challenges faced by small-scale food producers and workers who are the backbone of local, national, and territorial food systems, which provide most of the food consumed in the world. And 5, they do not take into account and build on the relevant policy outcomes of the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security. They fail to draw lessons from previous global food price crises. In fact, the recent WTO conference failed to support crucial, long-standing priority issues, particularly the rights of developing countries to build food stocks and reserves through public procurement and remunerative support prices. The CSM is currently undertaking people's consultations to build our collective understanding of the impacts of multiple crises and identify transformative policy proposals to further enrich our contributions to the CFS. My colleague, Dee Woods, who will speak later today at the United Nations in New York, and I put forth the following demands to the CFS and the UN system. Policy responses need to be anchored in a comprehensive human rights approach, recognizing the agency of those most affected as rights holders and the accountability of governments as duty bearers. Global policy coordination needs to be urgently implemented with an inclusive multilateral governance mechanism within the CFS that affords priority voice for most affected countries and constituencies. The CFS has the convening power and the mandate, with the support of the high-level panel of experts, to coordinate and strengthen collaborative action, to provide support and advice to countries and regions, as well as to monitor the policy uptake and implementation and their impacts on the right to adequate food. Therefore, the CSIPM demands that the CFS members adopt as CFS 50 in October the decision to give guidance for coordinated short-term and long-term structural responses within the mandate of the CFS. We propose 1, using the CFS convening power and coordinating mandate to develop an inclusive food crisis mechanism to monitor the current crisis and prevent and address future crises. This mechanism would install an open-ended working group on monitoring the food crisis and continuously assessing food crisis trends, would support and advise food import dependent countries in transforming their food systems through the diversification of their economies and breaking their dependencies on food imports and external inputs, including synthetic fertilizers and chemicals. And it would address and assess the impacts of trade agreements and finance and investment rules on food security and nutrition. It would address speculative behaviors in the short and long term, and assess how public food stocks and reserves can protect against shocks. We also propose 2, agreeing in the multi-year program of work rolling section to monitor the update of CFS decisions on food price volatility and social protection. And propose number 3, ensuring the future CFS policy convergent process on inequalities will analyze how the global economic model is impacting food systems and how changes in the global rules and institutional arrangements shaping trade, tax, debt, financial markets, investments, and public finances are necessary for a profound food systems transformation. These demands, if implemented, could dramatically shift the power structures within our agri-food systems and put all the world on a path of agroecological food production, social well-being, and food sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty. These were analysis of the situation and also the demands by the CSIPM. As Patty mentioned, it's going to be later on presented by Dee during this high-level intersessional meeting in New York this afternoon. We now open the floor to questions or reactions from the audience. Please feel free either to write it in the chat, I'll have a look at the chat, or raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. Thanks to the speakers who are going to remain with us to answer questions or comments. Monique, I see that you have posted question in the chat. Would you like to present it? Well, I mean, in the chat, this is not interpreted into other languages, so we'd be
Sure. I'm happy to say it. Thanks so much. Those were really, really useful introductions to the different issues. My question is around whether there would be any key policy asks. I know that many have been listed here, but if there was like, I don't know, 1 to 3 key policy asks specifically at the climate COP moment that would be really valuable to push, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Monique. I wonder who among the speakers would like to respond to the question.
I think Molly has her hands up.
I can jump in, and I'm
sure.
sure others will have opinions on this too. It's really important that the next COP, the next climate COP, look at the impacts of food systems on greenhouse gas emissions. The food systems supply at least 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions, and some estimates say it's even higher. The last climate COP basically ignored food systems. So one of the things that EPAS Food is trying to do is ensure that food systems are central to this next COP. One of the things that is important to push is a switch to agroecology, because the agro-industrial food system is generating a lot of those greenhouse gases. And we can do much better with agroecology. A second key ask would be to support local and regional food systems. There was a recent report that transportation of food around the world supplied 20% of greenhouse gases. And I'm not sure, there may be some pushback on that. It was published in an academic journal, but the international trading system is certainly not helping climate change at all. So if others have other comments that they would like to add, I'm really interested.
Thank you, Molly. Now, would we have other comments from the speakers? Or Maggie, would you like to comment on this? I understand that you have to leave before the end of the meeting. So if you would like to make a comment, you're most welcome.
Yes, a very quick one, because the COP will take place in Egypt, and I believe that the issue of the transportation today with carbon emissions and so on, I think should be the policies that are implemented today by especially the transporters should be at, the discussion very high. I believe that's one important element that could be in the agenda of the COP. Thank you. But
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry, I have to rush because I have some facilitation to do. We are in the COAG, and it's starting in the next 10 minutes. So I may have to leave. I'm really sorry, really. If there are questions that are directed to me, I cannot answer, unfortunately. But
Thank you
anyway.
very much for being with us. And we're probably going to keep the channel open. And if you allow, we can send you also some comments or questions later on and a brief of what happened during this meeting. Thank you, Mehdi, very much.
Thank you.
I also see Patty has written in the chat. Patty, would you like to pinpoint?
Yes, I just mentioned it's a great question because, of course, all of these crises are intertwined. The current food price crisis, climate, small farmers and indigenous peoples, everything is connected. And it's the problem, of course, is the industrial agriculture that is the status quo. We cannot continue the way we've done. We do need to push back against the false solutions. Kirtana mentions carbon farming. I mentioned the aim for climate, which was proposed last November at in Scotland, and climate smart agriculture instead. We do need agroecological and organic farming and local, regional, territorial markets rather than a global supply chain, which is just adding to our greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Patty. I also see, yeah, so I mean, the COP is going to be something that's very important and we need to prepare for it. It's also happening in a country that is suffering from the current new layer of food crisis. And there has not been a lot of talk about food as one of the issues. So as also mentioned in the chat, there is no food day. And this is maybe something that we need to, from now, to look into how this can be organized. I'll be very, very interested in being part of this, and also in trying to. The problem again is this opaqueness that we really don't know what's happening, what's going to happen in detail. So we will try to figure out what's happening and organize ourselves well, so we present the issues during the COP. I might like to listen from Victor and then go back to the audience for questions and comments. Victor, would you like to intervene?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Yo quisiera enfatizar que sí, es verdad que estamos en la confluencia de múltiples crisis alimentarias, pero también es verdad que un factor que ha disparado la crisis actual es la guerra de Ucrania, y no solamente es la guerra de Ucrania, sino lo que estamos observando que es un escalamiento de las hostilidades y el incremento de los presupuestos militares. En los países de la OTAN, 2% del PIB, Estados Unidos ha aprobado un presupuesto de $800 mil millones en temas militares. Y esto amenaza con que esta actual crisis no solamente no se resuelva, sino se profundice y agrave en los siguientes meses. Y esta guerra y el escalamiento que estamos siendo testigos está acompañada, como se dijo en el informe de IPES, con otros 40 conflictos bélicos en otros países y regiones, sumado a los bloqueos económicos y sanciones unilaterales. Desde mi punto de vista, es necesario que pongamos en el centro de la solución inmediata el fin de las hostilidades, impulsar a las negociaciones de paz y establecer un alto a la carrera armamentista, porque mientras se destina dinero a las armas y a la guerra, no hay dinero para la alimentación de la gente, no hay dinero para apoyar la producción campesina, no hay dinero para tener reservas estratégicas de alimentos, no hay dinero para la ayuda de las poblaciones más afectadas. Es lo que yo quisiera enfatizar y decir que ya no es posible pensar en soluciones cosméticas respecto a un modelo que ha fracasado repetidamente.
Thank you very much, Victor. I will go to those who have raised hands. Judith, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hella. In terms of the carbon footprint of food, the CFS policy on connecting smallholders to markets is extremely important because it promotes territorial markets and short food chains. And short food chains have proved very resilient during the COVID pandemic, particularly where they are agroecological and direct from producer to consumer. I would also like to really emphasize the importance of the underlying neoliberal economic system that underpins the whole food crisis issue. And the fact that we have had the International Labour Conference on Social and Solidarity Economy and Decent Work is something that we need collectively to build on, because this is part of the solution, and we need to mainstream the conclusions and resolutions from the ILC and use them in our arguments for sustainable food systems that alleviate the crisis at multiple levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Carly?
Hi, thank you. Really great discussion. Actually, I was just typing my question in, so I'll just read it. I'm wondering if anyone here is involved in the Coronivia process on food and at COP and other platforms. And they're also an important entry point. Another important entry point could be the methane pledge, which is completely ignoring livestock production and agriculture's contribution to methane. They're only looking at fossil fuel leakage, et cetera. And that's like, I think, at least 1/3 of methane input. So I'm just wondering if anyone here in your important positions, are you involved in those two things? And then I also wanted to mention that I work with a youth organization, and for any youth here, there's a platform called Food at COP, which is a really good way for youth to get involved in the food systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carly. And thank you also for putting your questions on the chat. Claudio, please.
Thank you. A lot of the problems that we are seeing in several of the countries in the world is related to the import of staple foods that are not indigenous, that were introduced in many countries during the period of colonialism, with a result that the reliance on local staples for the major part of their calories have been replaced by wheat. And there is a need in the medium term to go back to those crops to provide the bulk of the calories, doing two kinds of things: a total replacement, which will take a lot of time probably, but in the millets and the cassavas and the plantains and the etc., other crops that are indigenous to those countries. But some examples from Egypt, for example, are mixing wheat flour with some other sources of starch to produce bread, which is, of course, in part a possibility for at least mitigating the need for huge amounts of imported cereals. So I think that La Via Campesina probably has the penetration globally to try to work with their constituency to make this point, both in the short run and in the long run, to revalue the nutritional value of crops that are grown locally, and therefore you have an independence on the importation of these things. I wonder if Patty has some comments, or somebody else from La Via.
Thank you, Claudio. Just before we go to Patty is going to answer, but there is a question in the chat to Victor. Is there an official document enumerating the good public policies of the Mexican government, the policy that had been taken, or even some figures documenting the success of such initiatives? It would really be good to use it as a pathway to follow. Victor, you can also put a link in the chat for everyone to see.
Sí, tenemos un documento que vamos a compartir a través de Martín para todos los que han participado en esta conferencia. Está en español y en una semana más podríamos traducirlo al inglés al menos.
Thank you very much. Very, very useful. I see from the chat also other people interested. We're all interested actually in these documents. I go back to Hans Risen Javier.
No parece que vaya a haber mucho tiempo, ¿verdad? Un minuto, tal vez, dos, no lo sé. Sí.
Yes.
Bueno, muchas gracias por...
Stay on
sí.
Moments.
A ver, sí, vale. Bueno, muchas gracias al mecanismo de la sociedad civil por invitarme en este debate que deberemos continuar, ¿no? Una reflexión rápida. Es muy inspiradora las reflexiones que el representante de México ha hablado. Sin transformación no hay solución. Sin transformar no hay solución. Y por tanto hay que cambiar las cosas. 40 años de un modelo neoliberal que no ha aportado ninguna solución a los grandes problemas de la humanidad, ni a nivel nacional ni a nivel global. Y que además sigue insistiendo con dureza y cinismo en sus soluciones. Y tenemos el último mensaje del Banco Mundial, el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, minusvalorando incluso el papel de la FAO, Fondo Monetario Internacional, hablando de que hay que prohibir la protección de los mercados internos y que eso de que bloqueen las exportaciones. Un ejercicio de hipocresía y de cinismo de una magnitud brutal y bestial. Y en esta tarea, en todos los escenarios, como el trabajo impresionante del mecanismo de la sociedad civil, los investigadores, los informes impresionantes, en el espacio de los gobiernos tendremos que ser muy tozudos en el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria para abrir y explorar y empujar nuevas sensibilidades. Es el momento, no lo vamos a conseguir porque nos empeñemos, sino porque lo vamos a intentar. Y no solo es Vía Campesina, es el Foro Mundial de los Pescadores, los consumidores, los pastoralistas, los pueblos indígenas y todos los actores. La tarea es inmensa, pero ya que vamos a esperar más, nos cueste lo que nos cueste, nos cueste lo que nos cueste, esa es la tarea en la que tenemos que estar comprometidos. y podremos hacer cientos de diagnósticos más. Sabemos a lo que nos enfrentamos y por lo tanto tenemos que estar en la línea de esa palabra inspiradora de la transformación. No es trabajo de un día y no nos dejarán, pero esa es la cuestión clave. Es muy importante esa reflexión que nos retrotrae por tercera vez en nuestra vida, algunos que tenemos alguna edad, a esa lógica militar interesada, disfrazada de tantas cosas, mientras las políticas públicas, no solo las alimentarias, las rurales, las de educación pública, las de sanidad pública, etcétera, etcétera. Por lo tanto, ahí está el compromiso. No solo es la COP, no solo es FAO, no solo es en tal sitio, porque por ahí también nos fragmentan en un debate. Nosotros tenemos que vincular todos los debates. Gracias por poder compartir con ustedes y poder participar y ahí estamos en esa tarea. También humildemente desde el espacio de la década de la agricultura familiar, en la misma línea.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we'll have to conclude our meeting today, but I think this is a very good start for opening up the discussion for the next month to continue this kind of discussion and debate and exchange of information and ideas. I'd like to close this with some conclusive remarks from Molly. Molly, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hala. And actually, Javier gave some great summaries of the discussion today. So thank you, Javier. Let me just say, we had great presentations today that really pointed at the intersections of neoliberalism, militarism, colonialism, which is alive and well in the world still. And some of the points that I would like to make, just a few, is that we really have to beware of the false solutions that are being promoted right now, such as we need to increase production, which will, of course, contribute only more to climate change if done with increased agrochemicals. And we don't have the fertilizer to increase production in the way that some countries are calling for. Other false solutions are increasing biofuel mandates, climate smart agriculture, nature-based solutions. These are all problematic, and we need to fight back against these. Another false solution, actually, is creating new top-down initiatives like this Global Crisis Response Group at the expense of inclusive fora like the Committee on World Food Security, which have developed useful frameworks and guidelines which have not been implemented. They're sitting there and they just have not been implemented yet. There are other really good examples of solutions that just need to be put in place. Questions of governance are central, and we really haven't, excuse me, we haven't addressed that much today, but a rights-based approach requires that the people who are suffering from violations and abuses of their right to food be at the center of solutions and the center of developing these solutions. Implementing the existing frameworks and learning from previous crises are essential steps. We can't continue blindly with business as usual because that's just leading us into more and more crises. And as some of our other presenters and in the chat have pointed out, transformation of our food system is essential. So I'll leave it there with thanks to the translators for staying with us for a few extra minutes.
Thank you so much, Molly, for this. It's a perfect closure for our meeting, but it's also an opening for hopefully more meetings during the next few months. The chat has been very, very interesting, and I would suggest you save the chat, or maybe we can save the chat and then send it to the participants with all the links. Thank you so much. Thank the speakers for the very, very rich and informative and interesting speeches, but also debate, and also the participants for the questions and for enriching the discussion. Thanks the interpreters for staying with us and for the good work. Secretariat of CSIPM as usual, and also the IPES Food for this great joint meeting. Thank you so much, everyone. And